Well, thank you everyone for coming today to the last workshop. This is the fourth in the series. My name is Sarah Sapouckey. I'm a licensing associate here at UIRF, and I also have my colleague Mihaela Bojin here with me today. Um, and we're going to talk about navigating industry opportunities. So let's see. There we go. Okay, so the first workshop was understanding industry needs. The second was storytelling for science. The third was engaging with industry. And then today we're going to take all three of these and sort of combine them together, see how we can take what you've learned and navigate industry opportunities and explore pathways for collaboration, and then how we can kind of nurture these partnerships long term. So I thought we'll just do a super quick round of introductions. I'm going to do the majority of the presentation, and then Mihaela is going to jump in here and there with some extra tips and experience. So Mihaela, I'll let you introduce yourself first.
Thank you, Sarah. Hi, I'm Mihaela Bojin. I'm a Senior Associate Director at the Research Foundation. My scientific background is in chemistry. I have a PhD from Cornell. I am a certified licensing professional and also a registered US patent agent. For a few years, I worked at the law firm drafting and prosecuting patents, so that experience is coming in handy now. And I work on licensing partnerships, IP strategy, tech management, pretty much like Sarah and Abby on sort of all aspects of licensing. Thank you.
Awesome. Um, Thank you. And I'm Sarah Sapouckey. I'm also a licensing associate here at UIRF. I did my PhD in molecular biology here at the University of Iowa, and then I actually immediately joined UIRF as a postdoc for 2 years, and then I stayed on as a full-time licensing associate. I mostly manage life science techs, so things like therapeutics, diagnostics, medical devices, mostly because that lines up with my background. I also manage the URF Technology Analyst Program, and I'm currently serving as the Vice President of the National Academy of Inventors Iowa chapter. And just for fun, I really like horses, dogs, and fish, and Mihaela missed her cat
You are
medicine
more
potion.
fun than I am. I know. I
Gotta do
realize
something fun.
that.
Okay. So just a little overview of what we're going to talk about today. So I want to do just a background about intellectual property and in particular how IP works here at Iowa from an academic viewpoint. And then this is really important for then understanding how we can interact with industry. Then we'll talk a little bit about how to initiate industry connections, the type of collaborations that may come out of these connections, and then how we can maintain long-term partnerships so you get the most out of your tech commercialization and you make sure that your technology actually makes it to the marketplace.
And before you move to the next one, I just want to say, since this is the last session in this series, if there are any questions from the previous sessions or if there's anything else, it's a small group, so feel free to unmute and ask any questions you may have. We are looking at the chat if anybody feels like they want to just type, but it would be great to hear from you as well.
Yeah, don't be afraid to just jump in or if you're shy, you can do the little hand raise function. Okay, so we went over this in the first three workshops, but I just want to remind everyone, or maybe if you weren't there, that UIRF really serves as a bridge between academia and industry. So this is just a little flow chart of how the process works with our office. It starts with research that's done here at the university. So this is where a lot of you probably are right now. And once maybe you've developed something where you think your research could have a commercial application, something that could maybe benefit patients or make the life of consumers easier, then ideally you'll disclose this to UIRF. Once we receive your disclosure, we go through a pretty extensive evaluation period. We'll file IP protection if necessary. So not every type of technology actually needs IP protection to be successfully commercialized. But if it does, then we'll go ahead with that. And then we do a pretty extensive round of marketing to try and find an industrial partner. And so the last few workshops really talked about this in depth, especially workshop number 3 and how we go through that marketing, and then how you can also use some of the same tools to market your research. And then ideally, we will find an industry partner, either an existing company or maybe a faculty startup that can take the technology and bring it from academia through product development and get it to the marketplace. And ideally, if things go well, this will generate revenue, which is then reinvested into the university. So just a little background on the University of Iowa, our particular structure and the offices that may be relevant through this process. So we have UIRF, which is the office that you're talking to today. But there's also the Division of Sponsored Programs. So these are the folks that help with grant submissions, sponsored research, collaborative agreements, things like that. There's also the Conflict of Interest Committee, the Research Development Office. So these folks can help you find grant opportunities, or they can help you find collaborators. And then we also have the Office of Innovation and their subgroup UI Ventures, who are a designated like startup office here on campus. So they help new faculty startups kind of get going. We also have a intellectual property policy. So the university has its own policy. And I really encourage everyone at some point to at least glance through and familiarize yourself with this policy. And it's through this policy that URF is actually able to take ownership and does take ownership of IP developed here on campus. And our main roles are really to manage this IP and then help promote technology commercialization and get these technologies to the marketplace.
And if I may say just a word about ownership. So I think this was discussed before, but it's kind of worth bringing it back. Even though some of you might be inventors or you work with inventors, whether it's faculty or students, just because you created it, it doesn't mean you own it. Because of the IP policy of the university takes assignment, takes ownership of that intellectual property. And sometimes it feels a little counterintuitive. And I'm saying this because yesterday I saw a lot of students in chemistry and we had a lot of back and forth on, but do I jointly own it with the university because I invented? No, the university owns it. And it's pretty much the same idea. The easiest way to think of it is imagine you're at a company. If you're at a company, whatever you're inventing is going to be owned by that company. I think the difference between us and many companies is we also share the revenue. If there's any revenue realized from that technology, from licensing it, then inventors actually have take 25% of that revenue, and that's personal revenue. So it's not money that goes to a lab, it goes to individuals. This is, and also one more thing, ownership, and we talked about this in other sessions, really depends on other agreements. And I bring this up because you have these other offices around campus. If there's a sponsor research agreement, it may have some strings attached to it, and the ownership may not be fully with the university. Or if there's a collaboration with another party, then it's similarly, the ownership might not be fully UIRF and the University of Iowa. It might be that invention might be jointly owned with other parties. So
Yep. And when you disclose to URF, we ask a bunch of questions so we can really be sure, who else may be a collaborator, who else may have ownership. So that's something that we go over extensively with inventors when they disclose to us. So nothing to stress about. Okay, so why does the University of Iowa bother protecting IP? Because it may seem a little counterintuitive from an academic perspective. And protecting IP actually really helps promote industry partnerships. So for some technology spaces, there's actually a really strong need for protecting your intellectual property. So these are things, some big ones that come to mind, like the medical space. And the reason for that is it really helps to incentivize public good, and it also helps to ensure financial return on investment. So if you think about the drug development these days, it's insanely expensive and it takes so much time. And no one's going to go through that process if they're just going to lose $1 billion and there's not some, at least, investment incentive. Not going to go with that word because I can't say it, but there's not some guarantee that they're going to make some financial return on their investment.
well, and
And
I'm only going to add to this, to your point, is if you look at the Fortune 500 companies, a huge amount of value in these companies is really their intellectual assets, including intellectual property. But this intellectual property has become tremendously valuable because of this innovation economy really stresses and differentiates companies based on their intent on these types of assets, intellectual property. And the easiest examples are companies like Google, right? Like the company itself has what, a bunch of computer farms, and those are not what are adding to the almost $1 trillion value of the company. It's really their software, their operations that are a huge chunk of the value. And the industry values these intellectual assets a lot. And this is not limited to the tech industry. It's similar for pharma, for pretty much every industrial sector.
Yeah, so these IP portfolios can be quite valuable to companies. And that kind of leads us right to our next slide. That's a really great point, Mihaela. These companies, especially like the top leaders, they recognize that innovation is a necessity. It's extremely important for them to move up the value chain, and companies know that innovation is a strong indicator of growth. And like Mihaela said, successful companies, they recognize this, they develop an IP culture, and they have really strong IP protection strategies that they use. So what is IP? Because we've kind of just used that term really vaguely so far. And at its core essence, IP is a creation of the mind. And in the US, there are 4 types of IP that can be protected. So there are patents, copyrights, trademarks, and trade secrets. So patents cover new and useful machines, processes, and compositions of matter. Copyrights are creative works. Trademarks are your brand identity. So think the Block Iowa logo or the Herky. And then trade secrets are confidential information that gives you a competitive edge. And so URF mostly works and protects, manages patent applications. We also will occasionally work with copyrights, but this is really only in the case that the copyright has a commercial aspect to it. So by that, I mean, think of like software code that's going to be licensed to a company, or maybe educational survey that could be used in a test-taking app, something like that. Things that we don't work with, that we don't manage, are copyrights on manuscripts, or copyrights on if a faculty is going to contribute to a textbook. So maybe they write a chapter, or maybe they're just writing the whole textbook. But those are the type of things that we don't manage. And then for trademarks, we have the UI branding office that manages those. And then we don't actually hopefully have many trade secrets here at Iowa. That kind of goes against the academic mission. And it's also very difficult to keep everyone from spilling the beans at a university.
Well, and it's really part of the university's operations manual. Part of the mission, as you said, is to publish, and limiting any type of publication. Essentially, it hinders whether it's students or it's even faculty from fulfilling their mission. If you're a student and you work on a project that has a publication bar, or and you have limits in terms of disclosing what you created, that essentially is going to prevent you from graduating, or it's going to limit your options, right, post graduation. So that's one of the key reasons why trade secrets are really not a thing we can commercialize or we want to commercialize.
Mhm. Yep, thank you, Mihaela. And so I want to just talk about patents just a little bit, because that's what we work with most, and that's when we go through the rest of the presentation today, the majority of rights that we license, or if we're working with a company, we're talking about patent rights. And so, like I said, IP is really a creation of the mind. Um, what a patent is it's a grant, a property right grant from a government to the owner of the invention. And these are actually individual to each country. And you have to file in each country that you want protection in. So in the US, the term is 20 years from the filing date for utility patents. So not the date that you're actually granted the patent, it's the date that you file the application. And you'll see that it says for utility patents. So these are the type of patents that are covering the majority of inventions that we get here on campus. There's also plant patents, which cover asexually reproducing plant species, and design patents, which covers quite literally the aesthetic appeal of an item. And I don't, to my knowledge, we've never filed a plant patent here at Iowa. And I think we might have filed one design patent.
Yeah.
I don't know anything about it. So Mihaela, if you have any fun information, you can share
Design
that.
patents have a shorter term.
Mhm,
They are only good for they are valid for 15 years. They have a yeah, but in general they are less useful to us than a utility patent. And not to get into it, but for instance, like if it's a Nike shoe, it has the utility of maybe more comfort, you're faster, you're whatever, but it's also the design of the shoe would be really cool and it's very unique. So a company like Nike might file actually two of them, two patents. One is to protect the, as Sarah said, kind of the um, aesthetic aspects in conjunction. In general, they are filed in conjunction with some sort of utility aspect. Most of the innovations we are really innovations that are have some sort of utility, whether it's new compositions or new methods of treatment or devices or so on. So we usually focus on those.
mhm. I think the one design patent we had was on a vase, if I
Yep.
believe. Um, just a fun fact there. So when you get the patent application or when you file a patent application and it's granted, this gives you the right to exclude others from using your creation. So it gives you a temporary monopoly. It doesn't actually give you the right to practice your invention. You may still need to get rights from others who have patents that may overlap with yours. But it does give you a temporary monopoly in the space that's claimed within your patent. And like we talked about a little bit already, and Mihaela talked about, these patents and IP portfolios can be very valuable corporate assets. They can be hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars. They're bought, sold, licensed, etc. So it's really important to be aware of what you have, what you need to file on, and then how you can manage that appropriately.
And I'll just add one more thing
Mhm,
to your slide, uh, related to the point of a patent gives you the right to exclude others from using their creation without permission. So, and that's where licensing comes into place. So getting that permission is really licensing. Granting the rights to that IP is what we do when we license a patent application. And that's why licenses most of the time, their term is the term of the patent. So when you license, you're almost like you're renting your IP to another party, and the rights to exclude others from using that intellectual property. And yeah.
Yep. And that's a great segue into um, just I wanted to review this a little bit. So, like I said, once you've identified a part of your research that can be commercialized, ideally that'll be disclosed, and then URF goes through that evaluation period. And during that evaluation, we have a lot of discussions with the inventors and the contributors to try and figure out, do we need to file IP protection? Who are we going to be marketing this to? Who could we potentially license this to? Um, and if we get through the evaluation period and we decide that we do need to file IP protection, then URF does manage kind of the IP, the prosecution and the portfolio completely. Like I said, we work really closely with innovators to help decide if we need to file an application, to decide what we need to file on. But once we do, URF does manage the entire relationship with outside counsel. We manage the patent filings, and we have a really great IP manager here. Some of you may have worked with her. Her name is Tyann Porup, and she manages these relationships and these communications, which are quite extensive. So kudos to her, because I would probably lose my mind. Also, just importantly, this comes up a lot. URF does cover all the costs that are associated with university IP. None of the faculty, researchers, anyone on campus. If it falls under the IP policy here on campus, we're paying for it. It's not coming out of anyone else's pocket, which I think some people get a little stressed over that because they know how expensive this could be. And then the last point I want to make is just that it's really important that we have a good relationship with our innovators, and that we have innovators who are willing and able to help during this entire process. You guys are the technical experts. We all have backgrounds that are maybe similar or kind of in conjunction, but none of us are going to be an expert in the exact field that your technology lies in. So we really need and rely on your help to make sure that these applications, as we're filing them, cover what you think is the novel, important, and marketable parts of the invention. Um, and during these discussions, while we're working with outside counsel to figure out, what we need to file on, what the claims need to look like, we also have a lot of discussions about who the inventors are. Who are your collaborators? Is there anyone outside of the university that we need to be aware of? Sort of like we touched on in the first few slides. And so that kind of brings me to this point. I want to touch really briefly on how we actually determine who is going to be an inventor on the patent. And I bring this up because it is a point of confusion that URF sees a lot. There is a big difference between an author, especially like a manuscript author, which is what everyone is, in academia is trained towards and geared towards, versus who's going to be an inventor on a patent. So if you're looking at a manuscript author, this is someone who contributes to maybe the experiment, or they contribute an obvious element to the experiment. It may be someone who's just doing the experiment. Maybe they're just pipetting or running a lot of Western blots all day. It could be someone who's just suggesting ideas, but maybe not suggesting a solution. Or it may just be someone following instructions. It could be, maybe someone who's explaining why or how something works, but not coming up with a solution or like an actual invention. And then I think we've all seen this before. Sometimes people are just added to a manuscript out of courtesy. And then this actually differs a lot from what is considered an inventor on a patent. So when we're looking at a patent, it's actually a legal determination. It's really important that we get this right. And an inventor needs to be someone who makes a creative contribution. So it can't just be an obvious element that everyone else in the world knows. They really need to conceive of a solution or contribute an idea that's not routine and not obvious. So it's really not just simply a pair of hands. And I think that kind of causes a little bit of confusion, the first few times that someone works with our office, because it's really standard practice to maybe add more individuals than maybe should be added to a manuscript. But we really need to make sure that we get inventorship correct on a patent. And that's because if you don't get inventorship correct down the line, this could actually invalidate the patent. So again, it's a legal determination that's really important to get correct. And if we do, we talked a little bit about how you may have collaborators outside the university. So this is one of the reasons why we're constantly asking, who else contributed? Do you have anyone outside of the university? Because then we need to start working with external tech transfer offices to make sure everything goes smoothly. So just to reiterate, like, you may have the world's best science, you may have a Nobel Prize winning discovery, but that doesn't necessarily make the discovery patentable, and it doesn't necessarily make that scientist an inventor. Okay, so I think we've made a pretty good case for how URF works with our innovators and how important this is for us to work closely with innovators, and especially for success of bringing a technology to the marketplace and working with industry. And so that's one of the reasons why we, Abby wanted to create this workshop series, is because providing a little bit of education for how you can do, like, understanding industry, communicate your science, market your research, and how URF does these things as well. I think we can work better down the road. And so that was one of their goals with this research or workshop, sorry. And so now I want to move on. We did a little bit of background, and now we can actually talk about how we can initiate and maintain industry relationships. So the first step before you can actually start talking to companies or reaching out, you probably should do a little bit of preparation and make sure that you're ready to have productive conversations with industry. And so the first step would really probably be to understand the challenges for translating academic work. So it's really important to make sure that you're asking the right questions. And by this, I mean, scientific work does not always have a direct clinical application. And scientific expertise doesn't always match the needed clinical expertise or industrial expertise if you're outside of the medical field. Sorry, I mostly work with medical technologies and things like that, so this presentation is kind of geared towards that, but the idea is work for all types of technologies. There's also a big lack of funding for the expensive I&D studies or prototyping, especially for things that don't actually further scientific questioning or hypothesis-driven work. So it's really hard to get funding for those types of experiments. And then we also have to consider the fact that industry is really profit-driven, and that's not really a priority for most academic researchers. So we need to figure out how we can bridge this gap between academia and industry. So this gap is often called the Valley of Death, which is a little dramatic, but I also think very accurate. So if you kind of look down here in academia, there's a lot, not a lot anymore, but there is a good amount of funding that goes towards fundamental research, that hypothesis-driven work that we're doing in the lab. And then there's some research for, applied or funding for applied research. So maybe some work that can get you a little closer to those IND studies. But once you start getting to the research and development phase, a lot of the funding in academia seems to dry up. And then if you look from industry's perspective, they have a lot of funding for actually bringing the tech to the marketplace. So those last few steps, but they are putting less and less funding into actual R&D. They used to do a lot more of their own R&D in-house, but not so much anymore. So they're really looking for others, like a smaller company, a startup company, to de-risk the tech, and then they want to acquire it and invest in those final few steps. So you can see there's this valley right here where the funding has dried up, but there's really important work that needs to be done. And so we need to figure out how we can bridge this gap between the preclinical academic work and the clinical applications. So first step, address the clinical need and the feasibility. So when you're taking a look at your research, if you think you are at a point where your work could be commercialized or you may have a potential solution, it's a good exercise to kind of look at the market and see what gap are you filling. What gap does your research fill? Do you have a solution to a problem, or do you have a really cool technology that doesn't necessarily fit anywhere in the market right now? And let's say you say, yes, I've got a technology that is going to solve a problem that affects 1 million people worldwide. I think there's a really great place. I think this could be really disruptive. So next you need to kind of take a look and say, is there a reasonable path to market? Do you know what FDA approval process is going to look like? Can it be scaled up? Can it be formulated to be administered to patients? Those types of questions. And then if you say yes to that as well, like you've got an idea of what needs to be done, then you should be able to clearly articulate the need and your solution before you interact with industry. And so workshop number 2 talked about this a lot. So how you can sort of craft your science in a compelling way and show that you are filling a gap, that you are filling a need that the marketplace really needs right now.
And I'd say before you go to the next slide,
Mhm.
you can be you and UIRF, so don't feel like you're lonely in this mission. We are happy to help out even as you go to a conference, or if you have disclosed and there's something very exciting and there's going to be interesting, like there's going to be industry there's might be a variety of people you think the relationships would be beneficial with them. Think about even reaching out to our office. We are happy to supply you with some of this information if you need some, or to kind of work with you on messaging. Both Sarah and Abby, we have worked with faculty on various pitches for industry for different meetings, and we are happy to review if you put together any materials or if you have any talking points. Keep us in the loop and use us as a resource to get some of this information.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we can help you, like Mihaela said, we can help you kind of understand what requirements or how to craft this information so that you can have a productive conversation with someone at a conference or if you're having a meeting. Especially if you take some time to kind of think about what they may be considering as well. So this ties in to the slide that we were just on, but from an industry perspective, they're probably going to be looking at things during this first conversation, like what does the intellectual property look like? By this, I mean, do we need a filing? Do we need to protect this? if the answer is yes, did we protect it? What does the patent look like? What does the portfolio look like? What are the claims? So that's going to be some of the things that they're thinking about. If you're in the medical field, they're going to want to know, do you have an IND filing? Are you close to it? Does this therapeutic, diagnostic, et cetera, need other types of FDA requirements? What are the clinical trial requirements going to look like? Or if you're outside of the medical field, maybe if you have a med device or some other type of device, do you have a prototype? Is there testing done? What kind of testing do you need to do in order to show that it works? Or are there other government regulations or post-approval marketplace considerations that you need to make before you're actually able to sell the product? And I just want to say that although it's really great to have a general understanding of those concepts, you don't have to be an expert. Like Mihaela said, we can definitely help you as much as possible. We also can consult with external consultants sometimes to get market reports, things like that. So you're not going alone on this, and you don't need to know every single tiny little detail when you go to meet with an industry colleague. But if you have a general understanding, that can really help set you up for that productive conversation, because I can guarantee they're going to ask at least two or three of those points. And they're going to want to know at least generally what you expect it's going to take to get to the tech to the marketplace. And the more information that you can give them, I think the better it looks for you. And it also helps that colleague or the colleague at industry, whoever you're talking to, it'll help them make a case and take your technology internally when they do a review. Because usually how these conversations go is we'll have a non-confidential phone call. There'll be a little back and forth about the science. They'll ask those questions, and then they're going to probably want to take the information that you've given them to a team internally, because they can't just make that call right there on the phone call. So the more information you can give them, the more likely they are to take it and discuss internally. If they have to go do 2 hours of research to try and figure out how your technology is going to fit in their portfolio, or if it's something that they can take on, if it's feasible for their company, I think they're a lot less likely to actually do that and take it internally.
And I know you're going to touch on this in a minute,
Mhm.
but just kind of a word of caution. Whenever you talk to industry, you do have to be a little careful on what exactly you're going to share with them. If it's
Mhm.
something more general information, you're talking about results, why this technology is better because it works better, like you're focusing primarily on the outcomes, then you likely don't need a confidentiality agreement. But if you're getting into how you made and how to use that particular invention, then it's possible that we'd need to work on a confidentiality agreement. And also a word of caution, this intellectual property is owned by the university. So confidentiality agreements cannot be signed by faculty or by others that would be, by your PI or so be careful again if you're having conversations. If you're not sure, ping us.
Mhm.
Again, Sarah's going to talk about it a little more, but keep this in mind.
Yeah, that's a great segue. Actually, we will get to that in a few slides. So let's talk about how we go about making these connections really briefly, because I know that they were touched on in the last few workshops. And then we'll talk a little bit about a little bit more about how the first few calls go, a little bit about confidentiality and agreements that come out of that. But just in case if you weren't on the last few workshops, URF does do a lot of outreach to try and reach potential industry partners. So we do a lot of different marketing, including email campaigns. We have a couple different newsletters that we send out. One of these is actually geared specifically towards industry contacts, venture groups, alumni, those types of folks. We are really extensive on LinkedIn, and by we, I mean mostly Hojab and Abby. They are the LinkedIn gurus, as you heard from Hojab last week. I know nothing about LinkedIn, so please do not email me after this if you have questions. Please email Hojab. He can answer everything and anything related to LinkedIn. Um, we also go to a lot of conferences and make actual face-to-face connections and try to meet new individuals. And then everyone at URF also has their own personal connections. So we've all curated our own little Rolodex of individuals that we can reach out to in the future. So maybe I know someone at Bowringer who is really interested in XYZ. So if Mihaela comes to me, I could refer, make that connection. Or if I need to know someone at Vertex, then I could reach out to Kellen, who's worked closely with Vertex. So we have personal connections that we work with as well. And then I'd also like to just talk a little bit about how important faculty relationships are. So a lot of times, existing relationships that faculty have with industry counterparts are sort of leading the discussions. If you've got a technology and you've already made a connection with industry in the past, then that is a great step forward. And that almost, I think a lot of our successful licenses kind of start through that direction. And if you don't have existing relationships or you want to make connections, going to scientific conferences is a great way to do this. And Abby talked a lot about this and how you can kind of, and workshop number 3 talked about how you can kind of market yourself. And then also you can rely on mutual connections. So maybe your colleague knows someone at a company that they could introduce you to and kind of work those relationships. Okay, so let's say that you've made a connection, you've met someone at a company, and you're going to have that first phone call to talk a little bit about your technology. So like Mihaela said, it's really important to be careful about information exchange. So initial conversations are almost always non-confidential, especially at the larger companies. They want to do non-confidential discussions first, and they are very quick to tell you that they want non-confidential, to please be careful what you are sharing on these phone calls. Um, Usually during the call, they'll ask about the science and, a more general aspect. They want to know about things that have been published already. And if there's further interest, then they may ask to put a non-disclosure agreement in place. And this is really great because then it allows the company to do a deeper dive. They could look at if we have patent applications that are still confidential, we can share those. They can do a little bit more due diligence. With a CDA in place, you could share some research that isn't necessarily published yet if you're comfortable with that. It also will allow you to get a better feel for how you could work with the company and how the company could work with you as the inventor. And so this is, Mihaela, did you want to say something?
I just wanted to say uh, about this that for you all, some of you might have been involved in the filing process. The first application we typically file is a provisional patent application, and that is a confidential document. Like sometimes that's not very clear. That's not a document to share with the company. If they say, "Oh, do you have an application?" "Oh, yeah, I have one. Here's a copy." Don't share that because that one is not publicly available and it should only be shared under a confidentiality agreement. Sometimes there's a publication that comes out right after we file. If there's a publication, that's always fine to share because that's obviously it's in the public domain. But when it comes to documents, if you're not sure, it's better to ask than
Mhm.
to send information. Because again, to Sarah's point, sometimes companies just don't want to get the information you have. So they want to get information that's in the public domain, and then they take an internal decision if they want to move to a stage where the confidential information is being discussed. It's not always the case that they will just move on to a confidentiality disclosure agreement.
Yep. And so usually at this point, we're also having conversations with you as the inventor separate from the company. So we can talk about, what is considered confidential and non-confidential. So we make sure that everyone is on the same page and that everyone is aware. And you're not going into these calls blindly and feeling stressed out about that. Um, oh, but then I really wanted to make a point about that second bullet point there where this allows the company and the inventors, yourself, to get a good feel for how a collaboration is going to go. And I think this step is really important because if you as the inventor don't see eye to eye with the company on how the technology is, what direction the technology should go, what can be done with the technology, then I think it's going to make for a really rough relationship down the line. And a lot of times, if it starts out like that, then the relationship may dissolve, in a few years. So it's not just for the company to get a sense of the technology and you. It also allows you to get, look into the company a little bit and feel a little bit more comfortable with that relationship. And then It's also nice because it allows the company to share financial information and development plans with UIRF. And we use that for down the line. If we're going to put a license agreement in place, we need to know this type of information.
And I was going to add, Sarah, in these relationships, always think of us as your partner. UIRF, our primary interest is protecting the university and the inventors. So oftentimes there are these discussions with companies and the faculty are like, oh, but if we give this away for free, then we'll be best friends. And it's like, you're not getting anything out of it. In 3 years, when you're going to have regrets about it because you insisted on certain terms, there's nothing we can do because we already signed some contract that's really not helpful for the university, for your lab. There have been lots of situations where faculty really push for a relationship, pursue the relationship, and then that kind of falls apart as soon as you ask the company for anything that would be beneficial to us. Their primary interest, as Sarah said, is really very financially motivated. And that means getting the best deal that they can get, squeezing every bit of effort and resources from the university side. So it's good to kind of work with us and trust us as we move forward, because if we do have concerns, we'll always bring them up uh, to you as inventors, or sometimes some of you may work with staff as like there are people in grant offices or other offices around the university. It's good to bring us in some of the conversations when it comes to partnerships in the industry, just to kind of get a feel of how the relationship is moving forward.
Yeah, and to Mihaela's point, you should always feel comfortable reaching out to UIRF. Even if you think it's something really small, we're happy to walk through something. If you have questions about something a company said to you, or if you have questions about a meeting that you're going to have, always you should feel comfortable reaching out to us, and we're happy to talk about that. And so let's say that you have your initial non-confidential discussion and they don't ask to put a CDA in place, or they aren't quite ready to move forward. And so what other outcomes could there be? So a lot of times when we have these phone calls, they'll say that they need to see more. And by more, a lot of things that they mean is they want to see, if there's not a published manuscript, then they want to see a published manuscript. So they want to see peer-reviewed work. They want more data. At a minimum, they want to see animal data, but as close to possible, if we're talking therapeutics diagnostics, as IND filing or whatever the first regulatory step may be, they want to see as much data as possible getting there. If you have a new device or maybe a new material, a new process, they want to see a working prototype. So if they aren't ready to go forward with a CDA, they're almost always asking for more if they're kind of interested in the technology, but it doesn't quite reach the limit that they have. A lot of companies will have, like, they need to see a minimum of XYZ data before they can move forward. Um, and sometimes, if you're not quite there yet, but they are really interested in the technology, they may want to sponsored research to try and get it to the next step to see if it could be something that the company would want to take on. Or they may want to go forward with a collaboration agreement or something like that. So, or maybe like a collaborative grant submission, SBIR, something like that. So that's a really positive outcome that could come out of this as well. It doesn't always have to be a license agreement or an option. There's other types of relationships that can come out of these initial discussions that are really beneficial for the science and the university, and for kind of keeping that relationship going in a positive note. All right, so Mihaela brought this up, but it's really important to formalize your relationships via an agreement or a type of contract. And I know from an academic or a faculty or maybe a postdoc perspective, wherever you are, it may seem like a hassle. Like, you don't want to hassle the company. They may be interested. You want to just jump into it. You want to get going. You don't want to spend time on these agreements or make it seem like the university is difficult to work with and scare away the company. But it is very important to formalize these relationships to make sure that everyone is on the same page, to make sure that everyone understands what rights are being granted, what's going to happen with any new intellectual property, what materials are being shared, what's expected out of both parties. So these are very important to make sure that you at least get some type of agreement in place before you start working with a company or before you start sending materials to a company or things like that. And when in doubt, always ask URF or DSP. Any one of us can help take the next step if needed. And so some of the agreements that are likely to come out of these conversations, if it's positive and the company wants to move forward, you'll either get, excuse me, they'll want to sponsor research or that collaboration agreement like we talked about on the last slide. And these are managed by the Division of Sponsored Programs. At that point, we would turn the conversation over to them, but then we kind of work with them in the background. So we consult on IP language and make sure that any of the information that was already exchanged, DSP is up to speed and knows what's going on. However,
And I'd add, sorry to interrupt you,
no, go
I'd
ahead.
only add that when it comes to various types of agreements, I've had a variety of meetings with faculty and researchers where you kind of just discuss where they are with their project or a potential partnership. And sometimes there's nothing for us to do at that point, but we are happy to recommend, okay, this seems to be the right department or group. So if you're not exactly sure who should be the party that's involved, just ping us and we are happy to work through kind of that, have a quick conversation. Usually it's like in 10 minutes you figure out, okay, this is what you're looking for. That's where you are with the project. This is what you need. It's this person at DSP or this person at purchasing or this person at whatever, like if there's any other office. So use us as a liaison as well.
Yeah, I think the moral of today's talk, if you take anything out of this, is to just reach out to URF earlier rather than later, and we'll have these conversations and make sure everyone is going in the right path. Okay, so we don't have a ton of time left, so oops, keyboard doesn't work. Let's talk about how we can actually maintain these long-term partnerships. So if you've made it through all of these hoops so far, and let's say you've got a company that is interested and wants to license your technology, how can we make the best out of this? How can we maintain a positive long-term relationship? Well, it's good because conversations don't end with licensing. You don't just sign the agreement and then everyone goes on their merry way and we never talk again. Licenses and even sponsored research or collaboration agreements, these are long-term agreements. So from a license perspective, they're often for the term of the agreement is often for the life of the patent. And if there's no patent rights, then it's a negotiated term. Um, and within these agreements, URF also makes sure that we have a lot of different milestones and diligence to ensure that the technology is being developed. And so these are ongoing discussions with the company as well. We also stay in close contact because there's always ongoing patent prosecution. And when we license, IP rights to a company, we do allow them to have a say and provide input on the patent prosecution so that we can make sure that the patent application is actually going to cover the technology that they're bringing to the marketplace and actually cover the product that they're going to be selling. We've also have a lot of conversations back and forth about billing with the accounting team, and then there could be future amendments. So maybe we need to adjust the diligence milestones a little bit, or maybe there's some new IP out of the inventor's lab that they want to add into the license agreement. So you can see that it's really, you never just sign the license agreement and then it goes away and then 10 years from then you start making money. It's really an ongoing conversation between URF and the company. And also URF keeps, we keep our inventors appraised of what's going on. We're not just keeping you in the dark and then discussing with the company. So it's really URF plus the inventor discussing with the company. And also inventors may be asked to be a consultant or an advisor to the company. So there may be some researcher obligations that come along with this. And this really depends on what's negotiated and what the faculty or the researcher is comfortable with. So like I said, you could end up with a consulting or a scientific advising role. You may be asked, or you may be the faculty or inventor, co-founder in a startup. And there may also be additional sponsored research or collaboration agreements on top of the license agreement. And these are all really great ways that you can maintain those relationships, make sure that the company is aware of what research you're doing that they may want to, take on in the future. and help the technology grow and actually make it to the marketplace. And I just want to talk a little bit about consulting, and I think Mihaela touched on this a little bit, but consulting agreements need to be very carefully reviewed, especially with the university IP policy in mind. URF does not review these agreements. We have no say. This is an agreement between you as the inventor and the company. And it's
And
really
even
important.
more, I'd say you as an individual.
Yeah.
So just be careful. These are personal agreements, and whenever a consulting agreement is done, one has to hire their own attorney if they need any legal advice, but with the IP policy of the university in mind.
Yeah. Yeah. So you cannot assign university IP rights to a company. So we always really strongly encourage individuals to review the IP policy, get an attorney, like Mihaela said. And if you're part of UIHC, I believe that their consulting agreements do have to be reviewed by their own counsel. Mihaela, is
I
that
think
correct?
so.
Okay.
I think they still have the policy, but if you, yeah, and sometimes you don't really know if that IP is really the university's IP. So you have to make it very clear that any work you conduct at the university or related to your work at the university is likely that you cannot assign it to the company. It's oftentimes these consulting agreements say everything and anything you discuss with the company is going to be the company's. Well, that anything and everything might be the university's IP. So you have to be careful what type of project you're taking on. Sometimes some of these projects are projects that actually should be collaboration agreements between the
Mhm.
university and the company. They shouldn't be private consulting agreements. So if you're not 100% sure, you can disclose the relationship. We can work with you through that and see, is that an appropriate contract, or should you have a different type of agreement with that company?
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's important to not sell yourself short when talking to a company. I know it's really exciting, but you have a lot of value as a scientist and you are the expert on your technology. So you should know that you are the expert and you're also bringing a lot to the relationship. All right, we're getting towards the end, just a couple more slides. So kind of putting it all together, some of the major points from today and kind of the last few workshops. One of the biggest one is to understand how your research fills a need, what market gap that you are filling, and then have a general idea, kind of determine what's going to help you bridge that valley of death. And by you, again, like Mihaela said, it's you and then URF. Don't be afraid to lean on us. We can certainly help you with this. Um, and that brings us to point number 3. So work with URF will help you bridge that gap, will help find potential partners and formalize relationships as needed. And if there's nothing for us to do at the moment, we'll make sure that you get into the right hands if, maybe DSP needs to have a say in it, or maybe you need to talk to the conflict of interest committees to make sure everything's being managed well. So we'll help steer you in the right direction. And then it's best and it's good practice to maintain relationships for future commercialization projects. So just keep in the back of your mind the folks that you're talking to at conferences. Talk to your colleagues and see who they're working with. Get an idea of kind of who is in the space that your technology or your research is in. And so for conclusions, thank you for sticking through to the 4th workshop. We really appreciate you taking the time to be here and to sit through these. The recordings are going to be posted on the UIRF website under the Innovator Education tab. That will probably take, a couple days for us to just make sure all the recordings and the formatting and all that is all set. And then don't be afraid to reach out to us. That is definitely a theme from today's talk, not only for if you have any questions or if you want to have a one-on-one discussion, but also we do a lot of personalized trainings and different seminars. So if you think that it would be beneficial to have UIRF maybe at a grad student seminar or at a department seminar, please reach out and we're more than happy to join you at any of those. And with that, if anyone has any questions or comments, we can certainly jump into that now.
I have a quick question. I
Mhm.
missed awesome talk by the way, Sarah. I missed the last one, which this might have been more applicable for. But so like I do a lot of like drug discovery work, and obviously there's like a really big barrier to commercialization there in terms of like
Mhm.
getting FDA approval for anything, and just how long and challenging of a process there is. but like I'm trying to look forward in my research and like let's say hypothetically a year from now, I have some like really promising like mouse studies and like some good preliminary like pharmacodynamics and kinetics stuff shown. How can the UIRF help like move to either like working with some company that can move towards FDA approval or like say help with like a startup where the goal would be to move towards a phase 1 trial? Or what kind of resources are there?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we didn't really talk about that. So thank you for bringing that up. But I think there's a couple different ways that URF could be beneficial. So first and foremost, kind of through that outreach and trying to help find industry partners. So if you don't want to do a faculty startup and you don't want to go down that route, we can do some outreach to try, or maybe we know a company that may be interested in your work and we could get them interested in your work to want to either sponsor some research or maybe fund the next few studies that are needed to get there. Because I know like you're well aware that it's really hard to get funding. Like the NIH is not funding those types of studies. They want hypothesis driven work mostly. And I think things are changing a little bit, but it's definitely slow. Um, and then the question about startups. So we have a lot of resources for startups on our website page or our URF website for entrepreneurs on campus. So these are things from lots of different funding sources, different education, just so you can get a sense. Maybe if you want to know a bit more about patenting, maybe if you want to know a bit more about fundraising or crafting the right pitch. We also recently became or took over membership for VentureWell and Turbo Innovate. And Mihaela, you can jump in if you want to talk about those a little bit, but we're also going to be adding that to our website. So those are some resources that you could use. And VentureWell is a great place for some funding. They have some competitions that they run every year that are for entrepreneurs and inventors to try and get their technology up and running in a startup. Mihaela, do you want to add anything or add in?
Mihaela had to jump off for another meeting,
Oh, okay. I'm
but
talking to no
I'll
one.
I'll jump in with one more thing. There are a lot of programs specifically designed for grad students and postdocs who are interested in taking a technology forward and building a startup around something. So I think that that would be a great option. And startups are often a lot more successful if they have a grad student or postdoc from the original lab that the technology was developed in because they have that continuity and all of that know-how that comes along with the technology. So I think that could be a really great opportunity to consider. And then another one is that there are groups called venture studios that will build a startup around a technology. They're kind of like VC groups, but instead of investing in a startup, they'll build the startup themselves and then invest their own money in it. So that's another option. And we interact with a lot of those different groups, and we can help set up some of those interactions between inventors and those groups. So.
Sounds good.
Thank you, Jonah.
Yeah, thank
Hey
you.
guys, I have another question.
Mhm.
I missed out on the two middle series, so maybe you guys covered this, but for the faculty startups, are there good, maybe this is something I can talk to you, Sarah, one-on-one about, but it just while we were on the topic, are there good
Mhm.
like case studies in terms of like how faculties balance their hypothesis driven basic science and their startup? Because I could see that being an
Yes.
issue because my one of my friends, he's in the VC space. He's like, it's sometimes difficult for faculty to get money because they know that their priorities are split, or like they have to report 25% on this grant, etc. So do you guys have advice on that or training or like what does that look like?
Um, yeah, so 2 points. One, I would reach out to there have been several successful faculty innovators and entrepreneurs here on campus. So I think it would be really helpful to just kind of talk with them and see how personally it went for them. And
Mm,
then the other piece of advice would be for faculty startups or student startups is to hire or bring someone on who is not a full-time scientist. So a lot of these groups, like the funding, venture capitalists, they, like you said, they recognize that it's really difficult for faculty members, to get that funding because one, they're spending a lot of time on the hypothesis-driven work, and two, they're not business experts. So they want to see that
hmm
you've brought someone on that can kind of help with the fundraising, help take the next few steps and help manage the business, because again, that's not a scientist or academic scientist priority. And they don't really have the training to do that.
I see. Is that like a lab managerial, or what's that title
Usually
called?
like a CEO or maybe a
CEO. Okay, okay.
chief financial officer. A lot of times when we talk to venture groups, and Abby spends a lot of time talking to these types of groups, they really want to see a good solid team in place. And
Hmm.
if there isn't a good solid team, then they sometimes are willing to form the company and create the team around the technology. But they, like you said, they really recognize that academic scientists are not the ones who should be leading these companies long term. Maybe in the beginning when things are getting started, but
Hmm.
ideally you'll be able to find someone who can step in as a part-time CEO or someone to help get things rolling past the initial steps.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Mhm. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you guys again for staying for all four of these and showing up today. Really appreciate it. And if you have any other questions, if you think of something 2 hours from now when you're eating dinner, then feel free to reach out at any point.